The house smelled like her. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked back through the door after the funeral. Not the flowers people had left. Not the food the neighbors brought over. Her. That particular mix of lavender soap and the chamomile tea she drank every evening before bed. 41 years of that smell, and I still hadn't gotten used to it. I don't think I ever wanted to. I set my coat on the hook by the door, the same hook I'd used since we moved to this house in '94, the hook she'd picked out at a little shop in Stratford on our anniversary trip, the one with the small brass cardinal on top. She always said cardinals were good luck. I needed to believe that right then. The guests had gone. My son and his wife were still there. They'd offered to stay and help clean up, and I'd said yes because I didn't want to be alone in the house just yet, but also because something felt off about them, and I couldn't quite name what it was. My son kept checking his phone. His wife kept walking through the rooms in a way that made me feel like she was measuring something. I thought I was imagining it. Grief does that. Makes you suspicious of shadows. I sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I didn't drink, and listened to the two of them talk quietly in the living room. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. The kitchen was just 12 feet away, and the walls in that old house were never very thick. The assessed value went up again, my son's wife said. I looked it up this morning. Not tonight, my son said. I'm just saying. Riverdale properties don't sit on the market. If we move quickly. I said not tonight, Cheryl. Silence, then the sound of her setting something down on the sideboard. Carefully. The way you set something down when you're annoyed but trying not to show it. I sat there with my cold tea and thought about what I'd just heard. My wife of 41 years had been in the ground for 6 hours, and my son's wife was already thinking about the assessed value. I didn't say anything that night. I just thanked them for coming and told them I needed to sleep. My son hugged me at the door. A real hug, the kind that lasts a moment longer than polite. And for a second, I thought I'd misread the whole thing. Maybe I had. Maybe grief was making me paranoid. But then his wife said, on her way out, "We'll come back Saturday to help you sort through some of Margaret's things." Not asking. Stating. And I thought Margaret's things. Not Mom's things. Margaret's things. My wife's name was Margaret. I closed the door and stood in the hallway alone for a long time. There was a letter. Margaret had told me about it 3 weeks before she died, in one of those conversations you have when you both know the end is coming, and you finally stop pretending otherwise. She'd pressed my hand and said, "There's a letter in the blue tin in the bedroom, the one from the Lunenburg market. Promise me you won't open it until after." After. We both knew what after meant. Promise me you'll read the whole thing before you make any decisions. I promised, and then I'd spent the next 3 weeks trying not to think about it. The night of the funeral, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. The blue tin was on the dresser across the room. I could see its outline in the dark. I thought about opening it 100 times, but I'd promised her after, and to me that meant when I was ready. When I could actually absorb what she'd written instead of just surviving it. I wasn't ready that night. I wasn't ready for a lot of things. Saturday came faster than I expected. My son arrived at 9 in the morning. His wife was with him, and she brought a stack of those flat-pack boxes from a moving supply store. She carried them in without asking, and set them in the hallway. "Morning, Dad," my son said. "You sleep okay?" "Well enough." His wife was already moving toward the living room. "I thought we'd start in here," she said. "The china cabinet and the bookshelf. Most of it can probably go to St. Vincent de Paul." I looked at her. "I haven't decided what I want to do with anything yet." She turned with that particular smile she had, the one that was shaped like patience but wasn't. "Of course. We'll just sort it into piles. Keep, donate, decide later. Cheryl." My son said her name the same way he had the night of the funeral. A warning dressed up as a name. She opened one of the flat-pack boxes anyway. I don't know why I didn't say something louder right then. 41 years of being a high school principal teaches you to pick your battles and read the room. but maybe it also teaches you to stay too calm when calm isn't what the situation calls for. I stood in my own hallway while my daughter-in-law began disassembling my home, and I said nothing. By noon, they'd filled 2 boxes. Books that had been on those shelves since before my son was born. A lamp Margaret had brought from her mother's house in Cape Breton. I watched from the kitchen doorway and told myself it was just sorting. It didn't mean anything. Then my son came and sat across from me at the kitchen table. He had his mother's eyes. He always had, and it had always made me feel something warm when I looked at him. That afternoon, it just made me tired. "Dad," he said, "we need to talk about the house." I set down my mug. "What about it?" "It's a lot of space for one person. And it's old. The roof's going to need replacing in a couple of years. The furnace is on its last legs. I'm aware of the state of my house. I'm just saying." He looked at his hands. "Cyril and I have been talking. We have a lot of debt. The kids' school, the car payments, and this house." He stopped. Mom's name was on the title. Both our names were on the title. He looked up. "Right. Yes. But it was her parents' money that bought it, originally, her inheritance from Grandpa when he passed." I felt something very still settle over me. "That was 30 years ago. We bought this house together." I know that. I'm just." He rubbed the back of his neck. "A lawyer might say it's complicated." "A lawyer? Dad, you've spoken to a lawyer." He didn't answer right away, and that was its own answer. "We just wanted to understand the situation," he said finally, before anything was decided. I looked at my son across the kitchen table. The table where he'd done his homework every night for 12 years, where we'd had Christmas breakfast every December 25th, where his mother had sat the morning she told me she loved me for the very first time in that kitchen, over terrible instant coffee we'd made because we couldn't afford anything better. And I understood that the conversation had been going on for a long time before I was invited into it. "I need you to go," I said. "Dad, I need you and Cheryl to take your boxes and go home. I'll call you when I'm ready to talk." They left. I stood at the window and watched the car pull out of the driveway. Then I went to the bedroom and took the blue tin down from the dresser. I sat on the edge of the bed, our bed, and opened it. Margaret's handwriting was small and careful, the way it had always been. She'd been a librarian for 32 years, and she wrote like someone who understood that words took up space. And space was worth respecting. I won't share everything she wrote. Some of it belongs only to me. But I'll tell you the parts that mattered to the story. She had known. Not about any specific conversation my son and his wife might have had. How could she? But about the pattern, the way his wife had started asking questions about the house 2 years earlier. Careful questions, framed as concern. "Are you two thinking about downsizing? Had you looked into reverse mortgage options?" I was reading that older homes in this neighborhood are really holding their value. Margaret had noticed. She noticed everything. She just never said anything to me, because she didn't want me to feel afraid before there was something to be afraid of. She also told me about the cottage. I hadn't known about the cottage. That was the extraordinary part. When Margaret's father died, he left her 2 things: the money we'd used for the down payment on the house, which I knew about, and a small piece of land on a lake north of Halliburton, which I did not. She'd kept it in her name alone, maintained it quietly for 30 years, paid the taxes herself from a small savings account I'd never had reason to look at. She hadn't hidden it from me maliciously. She'd simply kept it the way some people keep a candle lit in a window. Just in case. Over the last 2 years, watching her health decline and watching her daughter-in-law's questions become more frequent, she had transferred ownership of the cottage to a family trust. The trust's beneficiary was not our son. It was our 2 grandchildren, his kids, but held in trust until they were 25, administered by her sister in Halifax. She'd also moved the majority of what remained of her family inheritance, investments she'd managed herself since her father's death, quietly and competently, because Margaret was quietly and competently extraordinary at most things, into the same trust. It wasn't a fortune by Bay Street standards, but it was enough. More than enough. If you're reading this, she wrote near the end, then things have probably gotten uncomfortable. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry I won't be there to deal with it with you, but you don't have to give anything away that isn't yours to give. The house is yours. I made sure of it. The rest is for the children, the actual children, the small ones who still think you hung the moon. And I need you to let it be that. Then, in her small, careful handwriting, she'd written the name and number of her lawyer. Not my son's lawyer. Her lawyer, who had been managing these arrangements quietly for 2 years. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. Outside, a cardinal landed on the fence post in the backyard and sat there for a moment before flying away. I called the lawyer on Monday morning. Her name was Odette Tremblay, and she was matter-of-fact and kind in equal measure, which I appreciated. She confirmed everything Margaret had written. She also told me something Margaret had not mentioned in the letter, that the house title had been restructured 18 months earlier, quietly, through a process I won't pretend to fully understand, such that any legal challenge based on the original source of the down payment would be substantially more difficult than my son's lawyer had apparently suggested. Your wife was thorough, Odette said. She was a librarian, I said. They're thorough people. I also called my own lawyer, a man I'd used for 30 years for wills and property matters, and had him send a very brief letter to my son's lawyer, outlining the actual state of things. I didn't want to fight. I wanted it to be clear that there was nothing to fight over. The letter went out on a Wednesday. My son called on Thursday. He was quiet on the phone in a way I hadn't heard from him since he was 17, and had broken the car window, and didn't know how to tell me. Not angry, just quiet. I didn't know, he said, about any of it. I know you didn't. Cheryl. He stopped. She told me it was straightforward, that a lawyer she'd talked to said, "Your wife has been planning this for a while," I said. "Your mother noticed." Silence. I'm sorry, Dad. I know. I don't know how. His voice caught. She was my mom. Yes, she was. I didn't say anything else sharp. There wasn't any point. He'd grown up in this house, too, and whatever his wife had talked him into thinking was reasonable, I could hear in his voice that it had cracked open, and he was standing in the pieces of it. That was enough. That was its own kind of consequence. We talked for a while longer. I told him the trust, when it matured, would go to his children, not him, and that I hoped he understood why. He said he did. I'm not sure he fully did yet, but I believed he was trying to. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, I drove north. It took about 2.5 hours from the city, up through cottage country, the kind of drive where the highway gradually gives way to 2-lane roads and then to gravel, and the trees get taller and closer together and you start to feel like you can breathe again. The cottage was small, green-painted board and batten, a covered porch, a dock that needed one plank replaced. It sat at the edge of a lake I'd never seen before, a lake my wife had known her whole life and had never once mentioned. And when I got out of the car and stood there in the quiet, just the water and the wind and the pines and one loon somewhere out on the far shore, I understood why she'd kept it. Some things you keep because they're yours, deeply and completely yours, in a way that has nothing to do with ownership papers. I sat on the dock for a long time. I thought about 41 years, about the hook with the brass cardinal, about instant coffee, about the way she wrote, careful and small, making every word count, about a woman who had spent 2 years quietly making sure that the people she loved couldn't be taken advantage of, who had done it without drama, without confrontation, without ever once making me feel like I needed to be afraid. She'd been protecting me from the other side of something I hadn't even seen coming. My phone was in my pocket. I'd had the ringer off for most of the drive. When I turned it on, there were messages. Quite a few of them. Most were from my son's wife. I counted them while I sat there on the dock in the sun. 14 missed calls. 6 text messages. 2 voicemails I didn't listen to. I set the phone face down on the dock beside me. The loon called again from somewhere across the water, a long, wavering sound that carried perfectly in the still air. I looked out at the lake my wife had loved for 62 years and never told me about, and I felt, for the first time since standing in the funeral home, choosing between two kinds of floral arrangements, something that wasn't grief. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was closer to what Margaret would have called settledness. The feeling of things being where they belonged. I stayed 4 days. I fixed the plank on the dock. I made bad coffee on the small propane stove and drank it on the porch every morning, watching the mist come off the water. I read one of the paperbacks from the shelf inside, a mystery novel with a cracked spine that someone had read many times before me. On the third night, I found, tucked inside the cover of a field guide to Ontario birds on the cottage bookshelf, a photograph. Margaret, maybe 30 years old, sitting on this same dock, laughing at something off camera. Young and bright and completely herself. I set it on the windowsill where I could see it from the bed. When I got back to the city, I had a conversation with my son. A real one, the kind we hadn't had in years. I told him I wasn't going to hold the last month against him if he was willing to be honest with me about what had happened and why. He was. It took a while, and some of it was hard to hear, but he was. I told him about the cottage. He hadn't known it existed, neither had Cheryl, apparently, though that was harder to verify, and I noticed I didn't entirely believe it. He asked if his kids could see it someday. I said of course they could. That was the whole point. I didn't tell him about the trust in detail. Odette had advised me not to, and I agreed with her. Let them discover what their grandmother arranged for them when they're old enough to understand it. Some gifts are better given slowly. My son's wife has not called me directly since the messages on the dock. I think she understands now that there's nothing to be gained from it, and whether that's growth or just strategy, I find I don't particularly need to know. The house still smells like Margaret sometimes. Less often now, but still, in the evenings especially when I make chamomile tea and sit at the kitchen table and listen to the neighborhood settle down for the night. The cardinal hook is still by the front door. I hung my coat on it this morning. I'm still here, in the house we built together, with the roof that needs replacing and the furnace on its last legs, surrounded by the books she loved and the lamp from her mother's house, and every ordinary thing that makes a life. She made sure of it. That's the thing about quiet people. They do their most important work without anyone watching. And when the time comes, you find out exactly how far ahead they were thinking all along. I'm going back to the cottage in July. I'm going to bring my grandchildren, and I'm going to teach them to fish off that dock. And I'm going to tell them about the woman who sat there 30 years before them and laughed at something off camera. They deserve to know who she was, not just as a grandmother, as herself. That feels like the right thing. It feels like what she would have wanted. And for the first time in a long time, I trust that I know what that means. I've had a lot of time to sit with everything that happened, on that dock mostly, the one that needed the plank replaced. I fixed it with wood I bought at a hardware store in Helleberton, and it took me the better part of a morning, and when I was done, I stood on it and it held, and I thought, yes, that's how things are supposed to work. You put in what's needed. It holds. I don't think Cheryl is a monster. I want to be clear about that. She made choices that came from fear and ambition, and those are very human things. But there's a version of herself she could have been. The version that sat with her father-in-law at the kitchen table after his wife's funeral and asked how he was doing and meant it. And she chose a different version instead. That has consequences. Not punishment from somewhere outside, just the natural weight of what you decided to be, settling onto your life. My son is still figuring that out. I can hear it when we talk. He's a decent man who let someone he loved talk him into something indecent, and now he has to live with knowing that about himself. That's not a small thing to carry. I don't envy him that. But I also think it might be the most useful thing that's ever happened to him, if he lets it be. Margaret understood something that took me longer to learn. She understood that intelligence without integrity is just a sharper tool for making a mess. She was the smartest person I knew, and she used it quietly, carefully, always in the direction of something that would last. The trust she set up, the cottage she kept, the letters she wrote. None of that was about winning. It was about making sure the people she loved couldn't be turned against each other by the people who didn't love them enough. That's a kind of wisdom I'm still trying to grow into. What I know now, sitting on this dock on a July morning with 2 grandchildren asleep in the cottage behind me, is that you cannot rush that kind of understanding. It comes from paying attention over a long time, from noticing what actually holds and what only looks like it does. Margaret spent 41 years paying attention, and she knew the difference better than anyone. I also know that the moment I stayed quiet in my own hallway and watched those boxes being filled, that wasn't weakness. It felt like it at the time. But I think it was something else. It was me trusting, without quite knowing why yet, that the situation was not what it appeared to be. That somewhere ahead of me, something was already in place. I wasn't wrong. There's a photo of Margaret on the windowsill in the cottage. 30 years old, laughing at something off camera. I look at it every morning when I wake up. I don't need to know what she was laughing at. It's enough that she was.